So what power looks like, electoral power, which I think is really about power, period, is not only pushing back against those things that are about exclusion, but setting the agenda. And so setting the agenda that's multi-generational, that it's not attached to one person or to one organization.
Private foundations and family foundations tend to end up focusing on the interests of a family, a corporation, a private entity of some sort that has been able to generate wealth and kind of mobilize that wealth around something that they're interested in. And what's different about community foundations is community foundations, to me, when they're operating at their best, is about the identification and the harnessing of the power of community philanthropy.
Justice takes many forms and many hands. I'm Shane Murphy Goldsmith, President and CEO of Liberty Hill Foundation. I'd like to welcome you to Season 3 of Conversations from the Front Lines, where we tackle some of the most challenging social justice issues of the day with heart and honesty. This season, we're exploring the theme of igniting electoral power and defending our democracy. We've gathered some of LA's frontline political and community leaders to go behind the scenes of the fights for social change, the efforts to build community power, and the work to increase solidarity across movements. Get ready for some frank conversations and real talk on Conversations from the Front Lines. And today I'm joined by Fred Blackwell, Chief Executive Officer of the San Francisco Foundation, and Miguel Santana, President and CEO of California Community Foundation. And today's episode is called Show Me the Money. Hello.
Hey.
Hello.
I love the Merv Griffin vibe as a kid of the 70s.
My dad would be so proud. Well, thank you both so much for joining us today, Fred and Miguel. I'd like to start off with kind of a fun question to get us going, which is, what are you most fired up about right now?
That is a great question, Shane. I think what I am most fired up about right now is the national mood as it relates to the presidential election. It just seems like there's a lot of energy that has been infused recently, and I'm really enjoying and fired up about kind of the energy that has surfaced around this, particularly in contrast to what felt like a lack of energy earlier in the summer.
Yes. How about you, Miguel?
I would agree. And I think what's exciting about it is how it will ideally play itself out on the local issues we care about, drawing the connection around that energy, who's excited about having a first woman elected to the White House and a woman of color. And that voter is going to hopefully care about the issues we care about and really engage in advancing significant issues here in LA forward, like Measure A.
Great. Well, that is a great segue to our conversation on today's episode about electoral power building and this year's elections. And before we dig into the heart of that conversation, I'd love for our listeners to get to know you both a little bit. So if you could each share just a little bit about who you are, what fuels your passion for the work you do, and tell us a little bit about each of your foundations as well.
I'll let Miguel go first.
Okay. I'm just a kid from the East Side. Grew up in Southeast LA County, born in East LA, son of immigrants who were undocumented through my entire childhood. And I start there because it informs everything that I do. That experience, where I come from, who I am, is relevant to my day job, in some ways more relevant than my resume or degrees. And I get the privilege to be able to access that experience in advancing the issues that are the most important for communities that have been historically left out. And so it is a place like CCF where we help donors think about ways that they could advance the civic agenda in LA. I often start there when they want to know who I am as the new guy running this place, because it's important that they understand the lens in which I look at this work, and to invite them to be part of ensuring that the best days of LA are ahead of us. And so that is a real privilege to do that. And to be able to not only support the work that's happening on the ground, but as important as a community foundation, being able to advance legislation and policy and use our own voice and our own power to be able to make systemic change. We have the privilege running community foundations to have multiple tools in the toolkit. And as a foundation that has a big tent, a big umbrella, we think of ourselves as being the place where Angelenos come together and to advance a shared vision for the future.
Learned a little something there. So Shane, I'm from up the freeway in the Bay Area. I'm a product, that I like to say, a family of active Oakland people and also heavily influenced by that family. So, on my mom's side, some of your listeners may know my mom is Angela Glover Blackwell, the founder of Policy Link, and the work of Policy Link and her desire to found an organization like that is a product of who she is. And so I often tell people that in an early age, I was exposed to the concepts of social justice, economic justice, civil rights, Black power, you name it. My parents went as far as to send me to the school in Oakland that was founded and run by the Black Panther Party when I was in kindergarten and up through the first grade. So I describe myself as like the little kid in the back of the room with the coloring book at the community meetings, often wondering why everybody was so upset and when we could go home. That was my upbringing.
Good food, though.
Exactly. Exactly. And so, from a very early age, I was immersed in this stuff. I fell asleep in city council meetings. I walked precincts for folks who were running for city council, all that kind of stuff. And that was all my mom's side. My dad's side is really different, though. Like, my dad was the first to go to college, and his parents were from South Carolina and probably didn't even finish middle school. But as soon as they were old enough, they moved to New York. My grandfather actually had a bar and grill around the corner from the Apollo Theater, and I used to spend a lot of summers there. During a time when Harlem was not the Harlem of today where, gentrified and you got the Disney store, it was pretty rough. And during the 80s, my parents actually moved my grandparents to Oakland from New York, something that my grandfather never forgave my parents for doing. I tell that part of the story because my grandfather told me two things almost every day. One is, when you leave New York, you're not going anywhere. But the second, which was more important, was if it's not a Cadillac, it's not a car. And for me, all that represented like my grandfather's love and connection to Harlem and place. And like having a Cadillac in Harlem was the epitome of having made it. So I like to describe myself as influenced on my mom's side by the social justice and economic justice and activism, and on my dad's side, the kind of connection to community.
That was fascinating. Lots to I'd love to unpack all that.
Uh-huh.
But interesting. I mean, although your childhoods were somewhat different, you both later went on to work in government for quite a long time, and now to lead a community foundation in major regions of the state. So interesting to have a conversation with you both about electoral power, given your long histories in government and philanthropy.
And Shane, what I would say is that intersection of social justice and economic justice and activism and place, for me, was present in local government and continues to be present at the Community Foundation. And so both of those places and those stints have been really nourishing for me because they've worked at the confluence of those two things.
Yeah, I mean, I think our listeners have probably more of a sense than the average person about what a foundation is and how it works. But I would love to dive a little bit into, what in both of your cases, you run community foundations, could also be called a public foundation. Liberty Hill is very similar, a little bit different, but Liberty Hill Foundation is much more like a community foundation than like a private foundation. And I think your description just then, Fred, probably is not a description that most private foundation CEOs would offer. So I'd love for you both to share from your perspectives, what does it really mean to be a community foundation, and how is that different than, more traditional private foundations?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I actually love about working at a community foundation, private foundations and family foundations tend to end up focusing on the interests of a family, a corporation, a private entity of some sort that has created, that's been able to generate wealth and kind of mobilize that wealth around something that they're interested in. And what's different about community foundations is community foundations, to me, when they're operating at their best, is about the identification and the harnessing of the power of community philanthropy. And so what you're really doing is kind of navigating the interests of multiple philanthropists in a place and in a way that is guided more by the issues of the day, the momentum that is being created at the community level, rather than the interests of the generator of the wealth, so to speak. And so I just find community foundations to be real dynamic places where questions are being asked like, who's your constituency? Who are you accountable to? What are the things that you're working on? How is community involved in decision making? And they just don't seem to be, from the outside looking in, the same kinds of questions that are constantly being asked inside of family foundations and private foundations. So there's just a level of kind of call and response at the community foundation level that, coming from local government, I find really comfortable.
Fred, just riffing on that a bit, who would you say is your constituency and who you're accountable to?
I think that we have multiple constituencies that we are accountable to in different ways. Obviously, we've got boards that we pull together who, for the chief executive officers, we're accountable to, and depending on how the community foundation assembles that board, it could represent different stakeholder interests. For us, we've got community members on the board. We've got people who come from the investment community on the board, people who come from the corporate community. So I think a board is a really important part of our kind of accountability and constituency. Then we've also got donors. I mean, we've got at the San Francisco Foundation probably about 500 or 600 different funds that represent 800 or 900 different individuals and families that we're working with in any given moment, who have an expectation that they're getting something different from the San Francisco Foundation than they might get from a Schwab or a Fidelity. And so there's a relationship there around common interest and our ability to help them be effective in their philanthropy that I think makes them an important constituency group. And we're accountable and committed to and working with folks who we provide grants to, our partners on the ground. There's nothing that we can do that's worth talking about that we can do without the folks who are doing the work on the ground. So that's another constituency group. So like I said, we've got a number of them. There's no one group. And I think when we are threading the needle correctly, we're figuring out ways to find the intersection of all those different constituency groups and try to pull them into the room for some collective problem solving together.
Thanks, Fred. Miguel, what do you think?
My first week in this role at CCF, I went to the twice a year convening of the community foundation CEOs. And I got there, and what people wanted to know is, why would I leave a private foundation with a donor who's no longer with us, 0 descendants, with a mission centered around racial justice, to work at a community foundation where you have to fundraise and you have many, many different constituencies that you have to manage. They were all very curious as to why I would do that. And I thought about it. It wasn't a decision I took lightly. I love the Weingart Foundation. I served on the board for 4 years and was at CU for 3 years. Love the staff, the mission. The one thing I get to do here that I couldn't do there is access my experience, 16 years at the county and 8 years at the city, by activating the tools that community foundations have that private foundations don't have. And I think that's a very significant distinction. If we're about creating a better Los Angeles, then you can't do that by just isolating philanthropy to only a specific organization. You have to look at the systems that created the reason why these nonprofits exist and are filling the gaps, and constantly be advancing the ball to close those gaps. So a significant difference in what my days look like. I was the CEO of CCF, and on my third week, I had a board meeting. And joining me was the chair of the LA County Board of Supervisors, Lindsay Horvath, and the mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass, to present to the CCF board Measure A. And something I had been working on as Miguel Santana, the Angelino civic person, private person, but not as the head of the Weingart Foundation. Here, I get to show up kind of holistically, and we jointly presented Measure A, why it was important. The board committed now $3 million towards that effort. And so it was an immediate before and after, almost, in terms of what this experience has been like. It's very demanding work. It's very gratifying. And what I really appreciate about it in many ways is that I get to work with folks who I never would have met otherwise, meet Angelinos from all parts of Southern California, and help them connect their work and their vision to a larger movement that's taking place here, which is it's a privilege to be able to do that and to put their passion and their love for a place in context. That is a unique thing that those of us who run community foundations get to do in our work.
Yes, indeed. We'll probably get a chance a little later to talk about Measure A, but for our listeners, we have a whole episode on Measure A with Jennifer from PATH and Elise from United Way. Folks can tune into. We're also big supporters of Measure A. But I want to take a step back now and kind of talk about your vision for electoral power. And certainly, as you just described, Miguel, the opportunity for a community foundation to get in the trenches around building electoral power and influencing elections is one of the main distinguishing factors between community foundations and private foundations. But would love to hear both of you share what does it mean to you to build electoral power, and what does that look like? What difference does it make? And what are each of your foundations doing to contribute to that locally?
So, Shane, when I think about electoral power, what comes to mind for me is wins and losses that we experienced in California when I was like in my 20s. And, I don't need to go down the list, but there definitely was a feeling at one point in the early to mid 90s that every time we got to November, there was an issue that was important to Black and brown communities, BIPOC communities that we were losing on. And there would be the occasional win sprinkled in there. But for the most part, it felt like what was happening is that we would get triggered or mobilized around an issue or a ballot measure or a policy, and we would all run in and try to have a positive impact on that. And then the election would happen or the decision would be made, and everybody would go back to their corners to be reactivated when the next issue came around. For a long time in the Bay Area, and I'm sure it was probably the same in LA and California, that was the orientation to organizing and power building. And when I think about building electoral power, I don't think that, for me at least, it doesn't mean that we move away from that, but it means that it is more textured and layered and connected when that's happening. So it's not just about the issue and mobilizing around the issue. It is about really thinking about what the issue represents for our community and it being a part of a broader agenda around what we want to see for our families in our communities, both geographic and, racial or ethnic communities or gendered communities. And the specific thing that you're organizing around in that moment has greater context for you. So that's one. The second thing is that it's not just about the issue. It's about being able, or the policy win, it's about being able to implement the policy win, which sometimes takes years after the policy win has taken place. And the only way to really deepen the impact and have it sustain is to have governing power. And so when I think about electoral power, I also think about governing power. Who's in the seat? and what do they represent? It's not just about kind of putting dynamic candidates up there. It's about having candidates that are connected to an agenda and a platform that, like I said, is broader than the singular issue. So that's the second thing that comes up for me when I think about electoral power. The third thing, and I'll probably stop here because I know Miguel probably wants to jump in on a couple of others as well, is the ability is to have the infrastructure that provides you the ability to mobilize the people and the money to win. And so that infrastructure takes a whole lot of different forms, but winning nowadays, particularly statewide, takes deep pockets. And so now what we're talking about is not just kind of mobilizing people around issues, not just thinking about kind of who's in the seat, but the ability to really fundraise in a real way to win the issue, to get people in the seats, and to have the kind of influence with people who are in the seats that may not even be your people through money or through organizing to influence their decision making and to make the wins more sustainable as well. So all that comes to me to be in the mix when we're talking about electoral power. And it really, I think, represents to me a really solid and important evolution of the work that we've been engaged in.
Love it. Miguel, what do you think?
Well, Fred and I have determined that we're really brothers. He's my Northern Cal brother because he started where I was going to start. We both experienced all the propositions that Fred talked about. I was down here, he was up there, and I was at MALDEF at the time during that experience where we were on the receiving end of somebody else's agenda, a political agenda, a hate agenda, blame everybody else but me agenda. And our communities were being othered, and we were being told very explicitly, not only do you not belong here, but you should leave. And so that's what I grew up in. That's in my 20s, in my development, in my early career. That was the context in which I formulated my perspective. And the people I worked for were at the center of pushing back against that. Antonia Hernandez at MALDEF and Gloria Molina at the Cali County Board of Supervisors. And so I had a front row seat to not only the hate, but the resistance against that hate. Everything that Fred said is I agree with 100%. And so what it looks like in real tangible way is how far we've evolved from that today in California. An anti-immigrant candidate cannot win statewide seat in California. That didn't just happen. Some have tried and have been unsuccessful. One is trying right now. It is not possible for that to happen. We went from denying people's driver's license to now narrowing the gap of what it means to be a Californian, from healthcare to education, scholarships, benefits, making up for the failures of the federal government around national immigration reform. There's a very robust and strong movement of community-based organizations that are in it for the long haul, that are doing very intentional work in collaboration, both during the election period and not. And it's multiracial, multi-ethnic. It looks like the immigrant community of today. California, it's no longer a Mexican issue. It is the world issue. And so that evolution over the course of the last 30 years, this is the 30th anniversary of Proposition 187 this year, is the manifestation of everything that Fred just said. So what power looks like, electoral power, which I think is really about power, period, is not only pushing back against those things that are about exclusion, but setting the agenda. And so setting the agenda that's multi-generational, that it's not attached to one person or to one organization. The sum of its parts is strong and robust. And there is an intentional support from philanthropy to maintain that agenda. It is a very powerful reflection of what it could actually look like when it is advancing a vision for what it means to be a Californian. That is not only in direct contrast to what we're seeing at the national level, but I would argue actually creates a pathway, a, a roadmap for where the politics of the national level should go. And I think candidates that are seeking national seats are debating internally, like, which way am I going to go? Am I going to go, should I look closer to the right, or should I go closer to a politics of belonging? We've demonstrated here it's not only the right policy, it's not only the right humane thing to do, but it's the right politics if you intend to win electoral power and stay in power.
So fascinating to hear both of you reflect on the shift from the 90s. And throughout this entire season, pretty much every time I've asked this question about electoral power, I get an answer along these lines. It's incredible to see just how all of us really were birthed from the conditions of the 90s and the work to change that. And I think although it's so front of mind for us who do this work, I think for so many Californians and Angelenos, it's kind of taken for granted that this is a progressive place to be. Now, of course, if you're the darker your skin and the less money in your pocketbook, the more aware you are of how not progressive we are. But there is kind of a sense that we're a safe blue state. But really, the shift is so recent and potentially tenuous. And when I've had these conversations with other guests, we've looked at it from the perspective of grassroots organizing and kind of big picture infrastructure strategy and all sorts of different perspectives, historical perspectives. And today we really get to dive into sort of the philanthropic lens and what it is that community foundations, San Francisco and California Community Foundation in particular, can do about this that others can't and are doing about it. And I want to share with you a comment that one of our previous guests gave, and I'd love to get your response. Peter Dreyer, who you may know, is a famous academic who's been writing and thinking about this for a long time. And he talked about one of the biggest inhibitors of electoral power building and power building in general is that on the one hand, it's all funded by foundations. There isn't some other source of funding for it, for the most part. And that foundations tend to approach funding this work in sort of the opposite way that you were describing, Miguel. So you talked about it's not one person, it's not one organization, but in fact, conventional philanthropy really is focused on individual organizations and what they can achieve within a grant period. And they better achieve it and prove that they, as an individual organization, made that impact, which, disincentivizes coalitions. It disincentivizes multi-year planning and multi-year investment and responding to the dynamic landscape and so on. So what are your thoughts about kind of that perspective and how philanthropy may be inadvertently hindering the kind of broad-based electoral power building we all envision? What can be done about it?
It's a good question. And I think for the most part, Peter's analysis is correct in terms of where philanthropy has been in relationship to power building and electoral power, et cetera, in supporting movements and organizing. And I would say, particularly in California, I've seen some real significant shifts, particularly over probably the past decade or so. And I think one of the more significant shifts, which aligns with, I think, some of Peter's analysis, is that the way it used to work is that the organizers and movement leaders would come up with their strategies and tactics and send proposals either by shotgun or through relationships to a variety of institutions, kind of throw some spaghetti on the wall and see what sticks. Stickiness would revolve around the extent to which people sitting in the seats at foundations understood and had appreciation for movement building and organizing and that kind of stuff. And the change has been that while movement leaders are still at the tip of the spear in terms of strategy, what's happening is that the foundation leaders are sitting around the table with the movement leaders so that there's a greater understanding of the theories of change that are behind the decisions that are being made. There is a longer line of sight around what the impacts are of this stuff and what's actually being able to be achieved so that a funder could fund Measure X, for example, and even though Measure X may not win at the ballot, what the funder now understands is what the movement leader understands, is that part of it is the win, but part of it is the constituency that gets built behind the campaign. There's a different appreciation for what a win and a loss is. There's also a more nuanced understanding of what we're trying to achieve in the longer term horizon. And because of that deeper understanding, by sitting next to the movement leaders, there's a deeper understanding of what it takes to win, which is larger grants, more multi-year grants, more flexibility in the grant rather than it just being programmatic. And so I think that the changes in how you are seeing folks on the foundation side relate to movement building and power building is a direct result of the fact that we're sitting at the table now with the movement leaders and have a much greater appreciation for the strategy, the tactics, and how progress is being measured. And I wanted to go first because I know Miguel has the more concrete example with Pivot around what that looks like.
Yeah.
I think you're seeing it now. I've only been in philanthropy for 6 years, so my perspective isn't as deep. But from what I witnessed, I think philanthropy is actually working to support coalitions, working to coordinate its investments strategically as well as for the long term. And even when you consider the significant investment that the endowment has just made as a reflection of the huge contribution that Bob Ross has made to this work, the way I think about it, and I don't know if it was intentional, and knowing Bob, it probably was, is that there is now going to be a continuous commitment of investment to organizing that is not based on the political wins, that is not tied to an electoral circle, that is to make sure that infrastructure is robust and strong. The work that we're doing in partnership with our colleagues around the state through Pivot is about the same thing, about supporting innovation. I think what is significant of this moment in time is that building on the transformation that California has gone through, there's an intentional effort to support collaborative work at the philanthropic level, but also at the grassroots level. There's more that can be done, certainly, and we always walk this dance from the seats that we're in, whether we should dictate, you must coordinate with others, or whether we should allow them to sort of do their thing. And at the end of the day, all of these groups need the same support, flexible dollars that are supporting infrastructure, non-sexy things that are essential to keeping the organization vibrant. From my point of view, we're getting closer and closer to supporting an ecosystem that is evergreen and that has the potential of leading an agenda that deals with the most significant issues we're facing: ending homelessness, ending poverty, ensuring that every California has an opportunity to thrive, cleaning the environment. We are closer to creating the change on the systemic level for those critical issues so that this generation of Californians leaves California better for the next generation.
Now, you both have alluded to the national election and kind of the dynamic relationship between LA and California and the national electorate. Miguel, you talked about potentially having a woman of color run at the national level is really going to bring out the electorate who shares our values here. And, at the same time, as Angelenos and Californians' attention turns to the national election when there's so much at stake, and there always is, but in some elections more than others, and certainly this one, there's a lot at stake. I'm curious what you would say to folks about why LA and California are still important to invest in electoral power building, even when we know that kind of in the big picture ways, California tends to go in a progressive direction. What is the value of the work here, and why does it matter to continue to invest in electoral power building in LA and California when there's so much at stake at the national level?
I would say because we're the big experiment. As Angela talks about, this idea of being a multiracial democracy is a new thing. really has never been done before. We're demonstrating what it could potentially look like. And so to be able to be a case study, if you will, of what it can be for those who share our values on a national level, it's important that we be for something and not against something. And being for a future of belonging is what I think connects our values. And this is a place that is leading in that. But, I think the past is an important reminder. When you were saying that all of your guests mentioned the 90s, I also thought maybe it's time to get younger guests. I guess because that's all our shared reference point. But I think that it's a reminder of how fragile it is. And so it doesn't just happen. We have to be constantly supporting it and building it. And I worry significantly that our own communities, our communities of color, or our progressive communities are shifting in their thinking. The outcomes of some of the statewide measures will reflect some of that. We weren't able to reform Prop 13 twice. The ending of 209 failed in California. So yes, we are blue, but even the blue has some boundaries to it. And I think that's what we need to understand. Why couldn't we repeal 209, the anti-affirmative action? And it was our own communities who didn't repeal it. Why was that? And I think the rhetoric, we're not immune to the rhetoric that's taking place on a national level. And internalized racism and xenophobia is a thing. And I worry about how in an environment like California, there can be tensions that surface. And there's a real intentional effort to create tensions between communities, between the Black and Brown communities, between the Black and Asian community. And we're not immune to those things. And so that investment still needs to happen here if we're going to be able to demonstrate what it looks like to be the multiracial democracy that we want this entire country to be. I think we would all agree we're not there yet.
To add to that, I think we do have a tendency, because of who we are today, to forget who we have been and how we have exported bad policy all throughout the country. We perfected and exported police brutality in Black and Brown communities and hyper surveillance in those communities. We exported anti-immigrant policy making. We exported the anti-affirmative action movement around the country. So we still have an obligation to fix some of the bad stuff that we have done. But I think the point that I really want to make about the fact that we export these things is we still have a great deal of influence in California in the rest of the country. And just the way that we were exporting in the 90s and in the 70s with Prop 13 bad policy, we have the ability to develop and export good, progressive, equity-oriented policy. And that doesn't happen without investment in the infrastructure, in the relationship building, in the dotting of the I's and crossing of the T's that has to do with designing and implementing legislation. So we have reparations that we need to engage in, and we need to step into our leadership role in the rest of the country in figuring out how to fix these things and exporting stuff that's good as well.
All right. Well, we have to wrap up. But before we do, I would love for you each to share a call to action to our listeners. What is something that our listeners who are donors, they're voters, they're organizers, they're funders, what can they do to make a difference in this year's election?
I'll make my call to action a donor-oriented call to action. And that is because, what I learned when I came into philanthropy in this seat was that the jewel in the crown for many people who come into philanthropy, whether they're institutional or individual, is like programs and services at scale so that you can impact a lot of people with that. And I was coming from local government a little surprised by that I understand the importance of programs and services at scale, but it also feels simultaneously important and inadequate. That if we are really trying to solve issues at scale, we have got to get upstream and think about policy oriented, systems oriented solutions to the problems that we're trying to solve. And that doesn't happen by being in your silo and thinking that funding large nonprofit organizations to deliver good services are going to move the needle in a substantive way on the things that we are trying to solve. And so my call to action to the donor community is get upstream. Yes, we need to, collect the babies that we see in the river that are floating down the river. But at some point, you got to get upstream and figure out why those babies are in the river in the first place. And my call to donors is let's keep the babies from getting in the river. That's my call to action.
Reach.
So I just gave that speech 2 hours ago to a group of donors. I just didn't use babies. But where it starts, and maybe this is, certainly in the Bay Area, certainly here in LA, right now we're in a moment where folks are down about our places where we call home. There's a level of frustration that I hear from my family to donors to even civic leaders about a sense that we'll never solve these problems. We'll never end homelessness. We'll never build an equitable education system. We'll never ensure that every Angelino has the opportunities that they're entitled to. To get to where Fred went, you have to not give up on our communities. You have to believe that we have made progress. And in many ways, we have made progress. Once you give up, then we lost. So my call to action is not to give up. We love our community. We love our respective cities. We love our state. We have benefited from living here. We are privileged to live here, and we have a responsibility to ensure that the next generation also gets to be privileged to live here too.
Well, thank you so much, Fred Blackwell and Miguel Santana, for joining us today, and to everyone who tuned in for the third season of Conversations from the Front Lines. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment, and share this podcast with a friend who's interested in learning more about the fight for social justice.